Welcome into the Jazz Notes podcast. I'm Ben Anderson.
I'm Chandler Holt.
We are recording this on May 14th, our post-lottery edition of the Jazz Notes podcast. And not a great lottery Sunday for Jazz fans. I hope you had a good Mother's Day, because that might have been the only highlight of the weekend for you if you're a Jazz fan. We'll obviously talk about that. We will look at a couple more players' seasons in the rearview mirror. Get a look at Jordan Clarkson, Walker Kessler, Chris Dunn, Taylor Horton-Tucker. We'll move a little more quickly through those than we did last week. And then, of course, get to your mailbag questions. But before we talk about the lottery, any other news or notes for the Utah Jazz? Not a lot. We are in the quiet season for the NBA.
But like you said, the Jazz have had some basically historically bad lottery luck this weekend. They fell all the way down to 10th, but even more bitter than that, two teams that they were trying to out-tank jumped ahead them, and not only jumped ahead of them, jumped into the top three. Atlanta claimed the number one overall pick, and Houston claimed the third pick.
Yeah, I guess, you would have felt better if, Chicago had jumped up, because the Jazz were never going to out-tank Chicago. That they didn't have to worry about that. But they really worked to out-tank both Atlanta and Houston, and could have easily found themselves in those 9 and 10 spots, and those 9 and 10 spots were where the lottery balls turned up to jump up into the top three. Now, yesterday I had Kristen Peak on my radio show with Jake Scott. Kristen Peak is the draft analyst for Yahoo Sports. She's awesome. And she lives in Utah, so she really kind of has an eye on how to do the whole draft and everything, but has a little better feel of what the Jazz are and where things are with them and kind of what their needs are, because she just goes to a lot of Jazz games and scouts players. She said, dropping to 8 to 10 in this draft is really not a big deal. There are some years it would be really bad. This is not really the year to worry about that so much. But you still don't want to ever drop. You want to be up at 8, because if you're picking between 5 players and those are the 5 that are going to be on the board, you want to have your choice of those 5, and now you have your choice of 3 of the 5 because you've dropped 2 spots. So certainly not ideal. Man, at some point you'd think the Jazz's number would be called, and I guess maybe some hope going forward. If you're a Jazz fan, you can always point to saying well, maybe you didn't tank for Cooper Flagg, but look, Atlanta won the number 1 seed last year, or the number 1 pick last year, with a 3% chance to move up. Maybe even if the Jazz are better but not awful, you go in. If you don't move up, you hand the pick over to the Oklahoma City Thunder. But there's the slim chance you move up and grab a draft pick. I guess you could hope for that. But that was tough. That was tough Sunday. I really look. I don't get emotionally involved in the team or the games. I just I cover them and I enjoy my job. I like when the players are happy, and they're usually happier when they're doing well. So I guess that part of it I enjoy when they're winning, because they're easier to work with. But I truly felt for Jazz fans.
Oh yeah.
When I saw that, I just thought, man, Jazz fans who I interact with on Twitter and see really going through it and are just where is this team going, and what are these young players going to be, and is there even a plan? I get it. It's difficult and it's annoying, and then you just get another kick while you're down. I would like for the Jazz fans to have something that feels like something they can glom onto and be happy about.
Yeah, definitely. And like you said, it's definitely not a good thing, but also not the end of the world, because basically 5 through 12 in this draft is a lot of, it's more fit than, this player is clearly better. Like you pointed out with your draft analysis of the projected lottery picks, the Jazz could use basically anyone that they can get their hands on. So if there was a draft to fall in, it was probably this one.
Yeah, and we will talk about that. We got some mailbag questions about the lottery as well. But I guess let's just start with the player highlights for the Jazz. There's not a whole lot of news, as we said, unless you want to talk about the playoffs. But I think all you're doing is keeping an eye on what happens with Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell. And those, we will know more about those next week, because both of them could be out of the playoffs or moving on to the conference finals. All right, let's start with Walker Kessler.
So quick preview. 2 weeks ago, we started with the best vets. Last week we did the rooks. Now we have the other vets. We have Walker Kessler, Jordan Clarkson, Chris Dunn, and THT. We can start with Walker Kessler. Had 8.1 points, 7.5 rebounds, 2.4 blocks. Overall, kind of a step back from last year for Walker.
Which is funny, because those are good numbers.
Yeah, not bad.
8, 7, and 2.5 blocks as a second-year center in the NBA is a guy that you would be looking at as having a ton of upside and being he's still very young. He's only 22 years old. He'll be 23 when next season starts. Those are the types of players you like to have on your roster and build around, but you can't watch what happened this year compared to what happened last year and the number of just 0 impact games he had, and think that he made progress. Yeah. In fact, it did feel like a step backwards. His shooting percentage was way down from last year. I know he dealt with an elbow injury that was bothering him at the beginning of the year. He came back, but by that point, the fit with John Collins was really wonky. So there was a lot more question marks coming out of this season with Walker Kessler than I think there were positives.
Yeah. For his best moment, I had the month of December. He had double digits in 8 of 13 games and 3 or more blocks in 6 of those games, averaged 9, 8.2, and 2.8 on about 70% from the floor. Honorable mention, though, early on in the season, had 22 points and 13 rebounds against Denver.
Yeah, that is my high point of the season, and because he's young enough, I'm still okay going to like single games and being like, do you still show it? Do you still have those moments where you break out? Because we were talking early in the year just about how bad he had been. He was coming off of a 2-point game at Phoenix, and then the Jazz go into Denver 2 nights later, and he has 22 and 13 and plays really well against Nikola Jokic. And like, okay, yeah, that's the Walker Kessler who we all saw in his rookie season and thought could be a core piece for the Jazz going forward. And then weirdly just never got back to it. Never got back to it any point being that type of player again this season. In fact, how many games did he score double digits? 25 total. He had 39 when he scored between 0 and 9 points. Like, man, that was bizarre because at 7 feet tall, with his willingness to dunk the ball, and I know he got fewer touches because John Collins was on the team, but like getting offensive rebounds, getting putbacks, getting lobs, you should be able to get 10 points more often than not just by being that size and being relatively skilled, and we just didn't see it at all.
True. I do think that, like you said, there were some fit issues, especially with John Collins' addition. And last year he probably had more opportunities because of that, specifically getting easy looks at the rim. John Collins took some of those. My worst moment, I just had how he finished the season. I felt like it sort of all accumulated, like the inconsistency from the year. And then by the end of the year, there was confidence and body language issues. And there was the story, I forgot exactly what happened, but Will Hardy and him on the sideline in that one game. For his overall impact, I just had it as okay. Maybe like a C flat, C minus. Played 64 games, started 22. However, I think he's still seen as an important part of the Jazz rebuild, and something that I want NBA fans and Jazz fans specifically to acknowledge is that growth isn't always linear in the NBA.
It's definitely not.
Yeah, like a lot of players are like, or a lot of people think, okay, he was this good in year 1, he should be this good by year 2, and then year 3 he's an all-star. It doesn't always work out like that.
No, at all. And there's a term for it. The sophomore slump is like a thing is very well known, and he had a sophomore slump. David Locke has a theory on it where your first year in the NBA, you come in, you do what you're good at. Your second year, you try and focus on all the things you're bad at, and you try and make those strengths, and you realize, oh, I've just been focusing on the wrong things, and you have to do what Will Hardy talks about, which is get back to your fastball. And for Walker Kessler, his fastball is playing defense, blocking shots, getting rebounds, and being a complimentary scorer, and he just didn't do enough of those things this year. I think you're right. His low point, weirdly, was the end of the year, which you thought he's the furthest away from his elbow injury. Maybe he gains some confidence and figures it out. But his last 13 games, he gets 5 starts again. He's moved back into the starting lineup. He scores in double digits only twice in 13 appearances. He averages 6 points, just under 8 rebounds. He still blocks 1.2 shots per game, but shoots 66% from the floor, which is a step up, but he's just not getting enough looks. He just the fit was so bad with John Collins, and you're gonna have to pick between those two players. And just because of the Jazz timeline, I would probably still pick Walker Kessler, cost, efficiency, etc. But I mean, John Collins is a better player right now, and produces more, at least at this level. Now he makes 10 times as much, and that's an issue. So you've got to figure that out going forward. But yeah, hard year for Walker Kessler. Overall impact, low.
Yeah.
Future, undecided.
Sure.
I wish I could say there was more. You could legitimately trade him this offseason. The Jazz traded Ochai Agbaji. We'll talk about that more coming up in the mailbag.
Next up, Jordan Clarkson. This year, JC averaged 17.1 points, 3.4 rebounds, led the Jazz with 5 assists a game and 2.7 turnovers. For his best moment, I had start to the new year. From the 1st to the 20th, played 11 games, had 20 or more in 7 of those games, averaged 21.3, 5.2 on about 46, 36, 92 splits.
We talked a lot about Walker Kessler's step backwards. Jordan Clarkson had a step back this year.
Yeah.
He took a pretty mighty step back, in fact, where last year you could argue he had the best year of his career. I know he didn't win 6th Man of the Year, but he also started 61 of his 61 games, so he wasn't eligible for it. But he went from being a bench player to a full-time starter. First time in his career he ever averaged 20 points per game. He shot okay, 34% from 3, which is not a great number, but he takes a ton, and the Jazz needed him to take a ton. And he also had a career-high 4.5 assists. Now, he upped his career, or his career high to 5 assists per game this year, which is a really nice number for a guard. I mean, like, that's what you need, and I think makes him pretty intriguing in certain positions, but dropped his points per game by 3 points per game. As I mentioned, his 3-point shooting dropped to under 30%, which is a pretty bad number for a guard. So that was difficult for Jordan. And so my low point overall would just be his 3-point shooting, not necessarily a moment. But his high point, absolutely the triple-double. I can't think of a better player other than like weirdo Kenny Lofton doing it than Jordan Clarkson, who of this era where fans have turned their back on Donovan Mitchell, which I still don't fully understand but don't love him, are always going to wish that they had never traded Mike Conley and Rudy Gobert, though I think those were the right moves. Jordan Clarkson is kind of the through line that I think fans, even though maybe they're just like, we see what you can do and can't do with him, is going to be the guy that 5-10 years from now, they're going to be like, man, Jordan's one of the great Jazz players of all time. He's very cool. And I think he is very cool. And I thought his triple-double breaking that streak is something Jazz fans will remember for a long time. And honestly, maybe we need to do this once we go through our players. We just need to kind of break down our top 5 moments for the Jazz season. I mean, Jordan Clarkson's triple-double is up there with the best moment for the Jazz this year, easily.
For his worst moment, I had just the month of March. He averaged under 14 points. He brought up to 5.9 assists per game, 2.1 turnovers, and shot 36% from the floor, 27% from 3. And here's something that I kind of noted here. I think that Clarkson has a bigger impact. Like, his impact is felt more when the team is winning, i.e. Draymond Green, even though completely different players there. Like, when the Warriors had that tanking year that ended up in them getting Wiseman, Draymond was playing and he was like, people were like, oh, Draymond is not an NBA player anymore. Like, he's terrible.
Yeah.
But then Warriors come back and win a championship a few years later. He's a big part of that. I think that Clarkson has that effect in a completely different way. But yeah, I had his worst moment being March.
He had that thigh injury, too, in December that kept him out, where he was playing pretty well, and clearly that affected him for the rest of the season once he came back. So a lot of up and down from Jordan Clarkson this year. Still plenty of fun moments. The Jazz were, I thought, better when he was on the floor, clearly, and then he basically missed the last 20 games of the season. So Jazz were trying to improve their draft stock, and it kind of helped.
For his impact, I had decent, maybe B-, C+. Played 55 games, started 19, had fair share of clutch, notable moments. And I think more likely than not, for his future, he will be moving on pretty soon.
I'm probably at the point where I'd be more surprised if he was back on the Jazz roster next year. I wouldn't totally rule it out. It's not 0% chance, which some guys are 0% chance they're going to come back. But he's still under contract. He actually had only $14 million. Is still a good player at that cheap of a deal. And if you can't find the right deal, you hold on to him and you try and move him again at the trade deadline. And I could see him doing that. The Jazz have had success trading veterans at the trade deadline each of the last 2 years. And maybe this is the year it'd be Jordan's time. But I won't be surprised if he's shopped around pretty heavily this summer.
Next up, Chris Dunn. This year, Dunn averaged 5.4 points, 2.9 rebounds, 3.8 assists. For his best moment, I also went a little bit obscure here. Just his year-long locker room impact was his best moment for me. The Jazz have a lot of young players, and I think that for young players, they are, one, trying to find out what their role in the NBA is, but they also take a while to find their voice. And I think that Chris Dunn was one of the bigger voices for the Jazz this year.
Not that this is a good way to judge it, but what, off the top of your head, what do you think Chris Dunn's season high scoring output was this year?
Oh, maybe like 15?
13.
You
know what I mean? Like, it's really strange because Chris Dunn is super talented. He shot the three pretty well this year. Was it 36% from the 3-point line? I know he can get downhill, but he kind of needs to play pick and roll to get downhill, and he didn't get a lot of pick and roll opportunities with just like John Collins, which is probably the best way to use John as well. But Will Hardy doesn't run a lot of pick and roll on this roster, at least not just like dedicated. That's you're going to roll the ball up the floor and play pick and roll, and that's what you're going to do 30 times in a row. So Chris Dunn's scoring, which I actually think can be a plus, we did not see a whole lot of, and the Jazz didn't win when he did score in double digits, so it didn't really matter. But it was funny to me to see that number that low. I also, how many times did he break double-digit assists? Only 3 times. So, like, even when he was getting 25, 30, 35 minutes, he wasn't putting up huge numbers. So I don't want to say I was underwhelmed by Chris Dunn this year, but I thought his close to last season was pretty intriguing, and he didn't match that level again this season that he closed last season with, which is totally understandable. He kind of had to play in more of a system, and he started some games, came off the bench. It was a little all over the place. And the Jazz were a mess. The Jazz were a mess most of the season. So, best moment for Chris Dunn, I think that's actually a pretty good answer. It's just that he was kind of the leader in the locker room, and the team needed a voice, and he didn't blow up. And you know what it is? He didn't get hurt.
True.
That Chris Dunn is always getting hurt. He's kind of been Dante Exum throughout his career, where it's fluky, dislocating his teeth by hitting his face on the ground, an ankle injury that turns into a knee injury on the other leg. Like, I will say staying healthy was good enough for Chris Dunn because he's going to get another contract The question is it with Utah?
Yes.
And I don't really know. His low point, I'll just say, is that he never got back to the production he finished last season with.
Yeah, fair. I had November, December. He just one of the bigger questions for the Jazz coming into this year was, what is the backcourt going to look like? We didn't know. There's like 5 or 6 players, like, okay, who's going to play, who's going to start? Went into the year with his role unknown and sort of struggled to see the floor, but eventually sort of went into that leadership off the bench role. Overall impact, I had decent. I think I would put it around where Jordan Clarkson's was, even though they aren't anywhere similar play styles or effect on the game at all. I think that he helped bring the Jazz together in what was a rough season, especially later in the year. And I said future unknown, but his impact can't be overstated.
He would be really valuable in Phoenix, in Milwaukee, where they have like tried to get, Patrick Beverly or whatever to work. Like, I think he's that quality of player is probably a little bit better. Maybe he's not quite as good as Patrick Beverly, but he's not a headache the way Patrick is. So I think his impact would be higher on a team that's closer to winning. And some of the things he does well just don't matter when you're down by 15.
Yeah.
But they really matter when you're down 3.
Yep.
And look, the Jazz are supposed to be down 15 because they're letting Keontae George make mistakes and Taylor Hendricks and Bryce Sensabaugh make all these mistakes and figure it out. So Chris Dunn maybe gets a little overvalued there. Also, I will say he's really overvalued as a shooter. Like, okay, 36% is a decent number compared to what he was. He had 32 games this year when he made a 3. Or no, excuse me, he had 30 games this year when he made a 3. He had 36 games where he didn't make a 3, which you're a point guard. Like, you have to stretch the floor. And the most threes he ever made in a game this year was 3.
Yes. And also,
so he just doesn't no one respects him.
Yep.
You aren't respected as a floor spacer, and the name of the game right now in the NBA, especially for guards, is floor spacing. So until that number can improve as far as like takes and makes, I don't care if he shoots 36%. It's not good enough.
I was about to say 36% is solid, but like you said, he wasn't respected. I feel like a lot of his attempts were like wide open in the corner, things like that. All right,
which is why the Jazz had Keontae George take so many, just like he had to make up for a lack of three-point shooting elsewhere. And it's why Jordan Clarkson's three-point shooting actually dipped this year. He had to take more threes, and they were really difficult just because the Jazz wanted off-the-dribble threes that nobody else like Chris Dunn could take.
Yeah. All right, we can finish up with Taylor Horton-Tucker. Sorry, he averaged 10.1 points, 2.4 rebounds, 3.5 assists. For his best moment, I just had the end of the season, the games in April. He averaged 16.2 points, 2.4 assists, 44%, 37%, and 85%. I think that earlier in the year, maybe he was trying to sort of prove himself, sort of like keep himself in the rotation, and he had.
He got the starting job.
Yes, to start the year.
He started the first 8 games of the season.
Yeah, but then later in the year, I feel like all pressure was off of him. The Jazz weren't trying to win, and he wasn't really trying to prove anything anymore. Maybe to his next team that he can ball out. But yeah, I had that as his best moment.
Yeah, I guess the best moment, honestly, was probably being named the starting point guard. The problem was, in those first 8 games, he shot 38% from the floor, 32% from 3, averaged 10 points and 5 assists, which, 10 points and 5 assists for a young player is not terrible, but the shooting numbers are so bad, you can't play. You can't shoot below 40% and, under 33% and expect to be on the floor for long periods of times. I mean, Keontae George did that as a rookie. So you might as well just play the rookie in that situation who has a type of game that could blossom more so than Taylor Horton-Tucker's did. His high point, unfortunately, almost goes back-to-back with his lowest point, which was, for me, December 18th against Brooklyn. Jazz blow out Brooklyn. They beat him by 17. He goes 11 of 19 from the floor, 5 of 7 from 3, has 6 assists, has 27 points. It's like, oh, that's the Taylor Horton-Tucker game. Like, those are when he's at his best. And literally 2 days later, he's out of the rotation.
Yep.
Like, the 21st, 3 days later, 1 game later, he's out of the rotation, and he's basically out of the rotation, not for the rest of the year, but until the trade deadline. So the heart of the Jazz schedule, they got rid of him, and it was when they were actually winning all of those games in December and January. He wasn't a part of it.
No.
And it's not on him, but the Jazz felt like they were better without him playing, and the results say that they were as well. So that's what stinks. Even when he plays his best, the Jazz didn't have a lot of faith in him, and then they weren't hurt by not putting him in the rotation when they were playing games.
Yeah, I had that as my worst moment as well. Just mid-season, December to February, fell out of the rotation. For his impact, have it as bad, D-. I feel like he doesn't really contribute to wins when he's on the floor, which was, like you said, proven by when the Jazz went on the winning streak when he was out of the rotation.
He was a worthwhile gamble as opposed to Patrick Beverly, who the Jazz traded to get him. He was still young, had a little bit of upside. I think that was a smart trade. Jazz, again, would have still just won too many games with Patrick Beverley, and Jazz fans were already mad that they won too many with Mike Conley. So Patrick Beverley would have helped you probably more and was he's a weird locker room guy and obviously had a very terrible close to this season and might be the end of his career. But, yeah, Talon came for 2 years, gave it a go. I don't think it's a match. I think he does sign another NBA contract. Like, there are enough teams that are cap-strapped that just need to add players. And at 24, 25 years old, how old is he going to be? He's going to be 24 at the beginning of next year. Someone will take a shot on him. Yeah. And I hope he makes it. He's a very nice guy. He really is a very nice kid. He's made a bunch of money. He's got a ring already, which is pretty cool. But I could see him ending up in like Philly, Phoenix, some of these teams that are like, we're just going to take a flyer on the end of our bench for a guy who maybe could come in and give you a little bit of a spark.
Yeah.
Let's take a break. Yep. We'll come back. We'll answer your mailbag questions. Stick around. More Jazz Notes coming up next. Welcome back to the Jazz Notes podcast. Ben Anderson, Chandler Holt. All right, Chandler, let's get into my favorite part of the podcast, and that is the mailbag section.
First up, question coming in from Skylar. Coming off his EuroLeague Rising Star Award, do the Jazz look at bringing Procida over this offseason?
Yeah, Gabriel Procida, if you've forgotten, was acquired in the Simone Fontecchio trade. Yes, while the Jazz were happy to get the 32nd overall pick, I actually talked to somebody who was really in the know of how that deal was done, and they were excited about Procida. One of the things they talked about a lot, and you can pull up his stats like Basketball Reference does international stats as well, he averaged more steals than turnovers, which was like he's a net positive possession guy, which is kind of a weird thing, especially for the Jazz who were really turnover prone this year. He projects as a pretty good defender, good size, like 6'7", really athletic. Now, he shot the three really well in like his first couple of European games, and that's really fallen off. And that's going to be his big step and probably his quote-unquote swing skill to stick in the NBA is does he ever become a reasonable three-point shooter? But yeah, what was he at, like 1.4 steals?
Yeah, 1.4 steals, 1 turnover, 8.3 points, and shot. Yeah, the shooting is definitely a little bit of a struggle for him. 3.7 attempts, 1.1 makes, 29%, and about 43% from the field.
Which is okay, but he's big and athletic.
Yes.
Has an NBA body. How many minutes a game did he play?
25. Oh, no, that's games played. Minutes played about 18.
I mean, 1.4 steals in 18 minutes is a playmaker on the defensive end.
Mm-hmm.
So that's pretty interesting and something the Jazz could use. I will also say this: the person I talked to did not think he was going to be able to get out of his contract this summer.
Okay.
So I don't expect to see him with the summer league, and then I don't expect to see him with the Jazz next year. I could be wrong. Things change quickly on that front. But that was kind of my first report because that was my first question was how quickly do you think if he's good enough could you see him? And they even thought that probably won't even see him this year. Okay. And maybe it's next summer league. And if he's good enough, he can stick in the NBA after that. But I don't expect to see him. But hey, that's not a bad thing to have. Like you've already got all these young guys on your roster. Let this other guy who's 21, 22, 23, like develop, get a little bit better, form an identity. Worst case scenario, he's a trade piece like you just used for Simone Fontecchio. But on one of these years where you only have one draft pick, and maybe it's the 25th pick, or you trade it, you bring in this kid, and he's your rookie, and he's a little bit more ready to play and compete. So yeah, it's not a bad asset to have. And congrats to him. Yeah, he was named the rising star of the EuroLeague. That's very cool. Good for him.
Next up from James McKinney. Ainge needs to make definitive choices with how he's approaching next season. I personally want to tank for Flag, but if not, what supplemental players should he go after to build around Markkanen?
Ainge would disagree with you that he needs to do anything definitive. He's going to play by ear, and whatever is best, he will do it. And if he doesn't feel like it's best, he won't do it. We've talked about a couple of names. In fact, we did a podcast on this maybe a month ago, and I will link to that in this podcast as well. Some names we talked about that have been really impactful in the playoffs are like Isaiah Hartenstein and some of those guys like that. Now, are they best because they're on a playoff team already, and that's going to make them look better than if they come to a Jazz team that won 31 games and all of a sudden has to carry a lot of weight? Like, probably he wouldn't look as good in Utah as he was, but is going to impact winning and be beneficial. But it's like how we talked about with Chris Dunn earlier, is the things he does well might not matter as much in Utah as they will on a team that's closer to winning. So there are names like that out there. I don't know if the Jazz are going to go and spend, $30 million in cap space, which they have 38-ish, something like that, to go get Malik Monk and Isaiah Hartenstein, which, you know what, would become your starting two guard and your starting center, which is a really good offseason. You add two starters to your rotation, you can do that. Is that what the Jazz want to do end up owning, the 18th pick next year in the draft, which conveys then to Oklahoma City. And, you sign these guys for 1 or 2 year deals at a high cost and they expire and then you can trade them again. Maybe. It's what Houston did. We talked about it a little bit. Houston, went out and signed Dylan Brooks and went out and signed Fred Van Vliet, and Van Vliet's deal is going to expire quickly, and they could use him as a trade piece, and okay, that's some value. It made life easier for Alper and Şengün, and it made life easier for Jalen Green. Maybe the Jazz do that. Maybe they just go and overpay for some veterans for a year, still extend Lowry Markkanen, kind of keep everybody happy that they're doing a little bit more winning and move on. I don't necessarily think that's what they're going to do, but I could see that. Otherwise, I would not be afraid of using draft capital to try and go and get a Cam Johnson or somebody like that from Brooklyn who I think could step in and fill a wing spot and help the Jazz on the perimeter.
True. Even Mikal Bridges, if the asking price isn't too high. Some other free agents that I would say are somewhat notable could potentially have a quality role with the Jazz. New York's Precious Achiuwa, going down more. We can bring Malik Beasley back to Utah. Sadiq Bey is a good name as well. But yeah, there's a lot of quality role players in this free agency class.
Yeah, and that's that's not big game hunting.
Yep.
Which Danny Ainge has talked about. Maybe you take a swing on a guy like Brandon Ingram, who's very available right now.
True.
Again, it's just like the idea of being definitive. I wish I could tell you what it is and like what those names are. And again, I've written a list of players that I think are top 100 players that would make sense with the Jazz that could come in and have an impact, but it's tough.
Yeah.
It's kind of thin, and then you have to ask, like, what ultimately makes sense. Now, again, I've said I wouldn't shy away from being a middle-class team in the NBA as long as you have your draft assets and don't lock yourself into bad deals financially. I like what Houston did, except for you owe Dylan Brooks $80 million over the next 4 years. I actually don't love that. But I like that Fred Van Vliet can come off your books. Can you find deals like that? Are there guys who said, oh, well, yeah, I'll sign a $20 million deal in Utah and go play there for 2 seasons, and if it works, great, and if it doesn't, they trade me and I go somewhere else. It's what Bruce Brown did with Indiana. Now, they traded him to Toronto. Does he wish he was still winning titles with Denver? Probably, but I bet you he likes his $40 million quite a bit as well.
Yes.
So you could find those types of players out there. You could find those types of deals where you overpay a little bit, bring a guy here, establish a culture, and then trade them. And you know what? That is definitive. Who those names are is a little bit more difficult because they could go any direction.
Yeah, and I don't want either the Jazz or Jazz fans to get caught up in the big game hunting message and convince themselves to go trade for or sign one of the 50 players that averaged 20 points a game last year. Because, like, think about bringing Brandon Ingram in, and then your front court is either Ingram, Markkanen, Collins, or Ingram, Markkanen, Kessler, and then your problem there is still like front court defense because Markkanen took a big step back on that end last year. Yeah. Ingram is not giving you almost anything at that end really. So yeah, I think supplemental players is a good way to put it because you could trap yourself by going big game hunting.
Can I throw a name out there that is intriguing for a couple of reasons, and it is kind of the way the Jazz, or at least Danny Ainge, does things because it's a little sneaky.
Yeah,
is Kyle Anderson.
Okay,
because you could probably overpay him.
Yeah,
he comes in, he can kind of play point guard. I mean, he's Joe Ingles, right? He's kind of that same type of player. You play him next to Keontae George. You just say, study everything he does, right? Like, he's going to teach you a lot about the game. He's super crafty. Keontae George is never going to be speedster. He's fast. Like, he's very athletic. I know he's athletic. We saw the bodies he caught throughout the year attacking the rim. But Kyle's going to really teach you how to play. Mm-hmm. And then, most importantly, he also hurts Minnesota, which you're in the hurt Minnesota business after you help them with Mike Conley and Rudy Gobert. Like, if all of a sudden you start to pick off some of their role players and they're going to be really expensive this offseason, I believe he's unrestricted. Like, Kyle is a guy who I would really look at, in all honesty, of like, come in, you just need good possessions. He doesn't have to do a lot, but he can get paid. He can be a mentor. He can help Will Hardy quite a bit of just like have the coach on the floor. I think he's got a good winning attitude. Like, I actually kind of like that he got into a fight with Rudy Gobert. I don't mind that.
Yeah.
And then if it costs the Timberwolves 5 games and a leader in their locker room, awesome. Even better. And they can't afford to pay him. So that's actually kind of a sneaky name I'd keep an eye on.
So
Kyle Anderson.
He is unrestricted last year, and last year he was only making about $9 million, so throw him 12 to 15.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's the mid-level exception. You can give him a year or two, or, again, you could go over that because the Jazz have $38 million or whatever this offseason, still be able to sign Rudy Gobert, and you say goodbye to him, or you trade him.
Yep.
Which Danny Ainge likes to trade vets. So, again, he's one of those guys who a championship-level team who says, man, we're really missing a guard who can have some positional versatility and isn't going to hurt our locker room. Those guys have value, and you would hurt Minnesota in the process. So that's the type of name that is not big game hunting, but kind of checks a couple of boxes that could be interesting.
Next question from Benjamin Smith. It's reported that Memphis will trade the 9th overall pick for a proven win-now player. Which players will be under contract for next year would you be willing to part with for that pick? What would Memphis ask for?
Would you define Walker Kessler as a win-now player?
Based on year one, probably, just based on like what we would expect him to go into his next years. After last year, maybe not. And also, Jaren is already sort of that rim protecting kind of role for Memphis.
Yeah.
So I don't know how interested they would be in Walker.
They did trade Steven Adams midseason.
True.
I think they need another big guy. Like the entire draft lottery was like, if they move up, if they could get Donovan Clingan, like that would be awesome. Well, Donovan Clingan, he's better than Walker Kessler, I think. But he's also 2 years away from being where Walker Kessler is. So Walker goes into his third year. He's only 12 months removed away from being an all-rookie first-team member. He was on a better team that only asked him to do Walker Kessler things, and he didn't have to share the dunker spot with John Collins. Well, Triple J, Jaren Jackson Jr., can hang out at the three-point line a little bit more. You've got Ja, who's not a shooter, so maybe you don't want to clog up space with Walker Kessler there, but he just serves as a rebounder and shot blocker and put-back guy. And his role is really reduced there versus what the Jazz kind of ideally I think you would ask him for. He never needs to score. He never needs to shoot the ball ever.
Yeah.
I could kind of sell myself on that.
You just sold me on it.
In Memphis, is it worth the 9th pick is the question. Now, maybe it is in this draft. I mean, maybe they just look at the board and how it falls and they just say, Rob Dillingham's on the board? Like, you've already got Ja. Or maybe they just say, hey, Rob Dillingham's on the board. We're in a good shape. Let's take it. And there are flyers on wings they could use. I mean, but they've got Jair Williams. So you know what I mean? Like, they've got some of these guys who are already still young and trying to piece it back together. They could use somebody who could step in and play right away. And the nice thing about Walker is he still only costs $4 million. He doesn't cost $20 million. And they are this team that all of a sudden has Desmond Bane under contract, Jaren Jackson Jr. under contract, John Moran under contract. G.G. Jackson suddenly looks like an NBA player, and they're going to have to pay him next year because he was an undrafted free agent or no second-round pick. So he's at low cost. It's going to get more expensive more quickly than a normal rookie would. I actually kind of think that makes a little bit of sense. Now, the Jazz probably have to add a piece in addition to that or take something back. Maybe it's the 9th pick for Walker Kessler, the 29th pick and the 32nd pick. Mm-hmm. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting.
Definitely.
If the Jazz were like, man, we love Reed Shepherd, and he's not going to be there at 9, but something like that, and Ron Holland. And those are the two guys that are going to be there. Maybe. And they've traded Ochai. Yeah. Like Danny Ainge has not been afraid to trade his young guys to get future assets that he likes better. So that's something I would keep an eye on. Oklahoma City has the 12th pick from Houston. 12th. Like, they need a big guy too. Yeah. Now, again, they just beat Dallas last night. But I would be curious what the market would be like for Walker Kessler if the Jazz made him available. Because, yes, he had a bad year last year. But, again, he almost averaged a double-double. He averages 2.5 blocks a game. And on a winning situation, he might be a good fit for really cheap.
Yes.
And these teams that don't want to develop another rookie, and the Jazz might be willing to do it, and he maybe needs a change of scenery. I don't know if he does. Mm-hmm. But if that's what you think, and that's what other teams think, there might be some value there. Because, again, 2 years removed from being an all-NBA team, really 1 year removed from being all-rookie team, I should say, those are good players. That's interesting.
Question for you, whether if the Jazz can trade for another lottery pick, whether it be the 9th with Memphis or the OKC pick or whatever it is there any chance that they package those or any other way trade to move up?
Yes. Oh, the Jazz could do it right now.
Yeah.
But, I mean, maybe you just package Walker Kessler in 10 to move up to, 6 or something like that. Now, I don't, Charlotte's at 6.
Yeah.
Do they need a center? I don't know. Maybe, I don't know what they've blown it with Kai Jones and what's his name, who they drafted from Duke a couple of years ago, was hurt all year. So maybe. There is intrigue there. There's options there. I would keep an eye on that, certainly. Last question here, coming in from Glenn Anderson about the draft. If you had to choose between Ron Holland, the G League Ignite forward, Cody Williams, the Colorado wing, Dalton Knecht, the Tennessee star, or Tajane Saloon, who would you choose and why? So these are the 4 wings, Chandler, that are really going to kind of be in that conversation at 10, probably through 16.
Yep.
And because the draft is so fluid, like if Saloon comes in, he's kind of the unknown guy. He's kind of who people think might be the Giannis of this draft because they're projected to go in the same situation. Very, very intriguing physical tools, who has not put it all together from his skill set, where like one night you'll watch him and you'll be like, this dude can really shoot, pretty intriguing, athletic. And then the next night you're like, have you dribbled a basketball before? Like, this is the first time being on a court?
Yeah.
Did you tie your own shoes to get here? So, of those four, let's just walk through the strengths really quick. Ron Holland, and we will do a podcast, a couple where we really maybe even do a mock draft, which could be fun, and just kind of get an idea of like who these players are. Ron Holland was the number 1 or number 2 recruit in the country last year. Was going to go to Texas, chose to go to the G League Ignite instead. Super high motor on both ends of the floor. Now, he shot 24% from 3. Now, the problem was the G League Ignite did not have a point guard. So they kind of just made Ron Holland a point guard. Well, he played power forward his last year of high school, was basically like their lead offensive initiator this year, and had some real highs, like shot creation, and shot 24% from 3. Now, he had like 4 or 5 games where he made 3 threes. He ended up with a hand injury midway through the season, so he didn't play the last 15 or so games of the year. So it was kind of an incomplete season. I almost want to compare him to like late career Russell Westbrook, but he's 6'6".
Okay.
You know what I mean? He's not 6'4". Now, he's not that crazy.
Yeah.
But like Russell Westbrook actually was impactful this year for the Clippers as their 6th man. And maybe like that's the basement for Ron Holland, not Russell Westbrook, but like late career guy who has a crazy motor, still really dangerous in transition, but like the shooting's a major issue.
Yeah.
And so he's flawed and can do a little bit of everything, but nothing great. Or if he really hits, he's intriguing because the 3-point shot comes around. He's freakishly athletic. He plays like he wants to be a star. Now, those guys also bust because they like, what do? I don't touch the ball?
Yeah.
How am I supposed to help the team if I'm not touching the ball? That's kind of the up and down of Ron Holland there, where like if it hits, it really hits. If it doesn't, it could be a mess.
Yep.
Cody Williams at one point was projected to be the top overall pick in the draft. Ended up with a bunch of injuries at Colorado. Really slight frame, but he is 6'8". He's just 186 pounds. I mean, that's what you and I weigh. That's the problem. Like he needs to get a lot bigger, and neither of us is 6'8" actually. Yeah. So he needs to put on weight. He shot over 40% from 3, like 44%. The problem was he never took threes. It's like he doesn't trust himself to shoot it that well. Has crazy touch inside the paint. Like gets fouled and finishes through contact with the right and the left hand despite the fact that he's so thin. And, of course, his brother is Jalen Williams, the star for the Oklahoma City Thunder. I really like Cody Williams. I like that I don't think he needs a big city to be successful. Like he was the top 10 recruit and he chose Colorado. Now, yeah. I'm sure they offered him money, but like he didn't go to Kentucky. He didn't go to Kansas. He didn't go to Duke. Like he's like, I'm fine being in a small market. His brother plays in Oklahoma City and apparently loves it. So I think he would make sense in Utah, but he has some bust potential of like, what if he just never becomes aggressive and doesn't put on the weight, even though I think that's the thing I'm most confident in guys doing once they get to the NBA is having a good workout routine and being fed well and actually putting on the weight. And he's young. He will become a man in the NBA. And the upside is really there, too, similar to Ron Holland. Dalton Knecht is 23. He's the oldest player projected to be in the lottery. Can just shoot the heck out of the ball. Yeah. In fact, watching him play offensively, like think of like a poor man Jason Tatum. Not as a passer. He doesn't pass like Jason Tatum, but like hits crazy shots, deadly three-point shooter, actually really good getting to the rim, finishes on top of the basket really easily. I love his takeoff points on the floor. Like some guys in college have to be right at the rim before they will jump. And it's like, well, it's too late at that point because shot blockers are too good. He will jump a step inside the free throw line and find like weird angles and weird little like slots to get all his shot off through. But he's 6'6" and has a 40-inch vertical. I think it was 38 yesterday. He measured at the combine. Like his athleticism and shooting absolutely are going to translate, but he's 23.
Yeah. That's
so the upside's not there, and he's not a good defensive player. So the Jazz need defensive players. And then finally, we mentioned Saloon as kind of the mystery. Of those four, I would rank Saloon last. Dalton Knecht just like plugs and plays, and I actually think there's something to that.
Yeah.
That he can help right away and actually does all the things the Jazz need, which is shooting. Ron Holland and Cody Williams are the high upside picks. I kind of would probably put Holland a little bit over Cody Williams, but like very narrowly.
Yeah.
And that's purely from watching. I will say this, and this really matters. Everybody who's only watched Ron Holland is like, this guy's the 5th pick. everybody who has talked to Ron Holland is like, he's like a 12th guy, 10th guy. That usually tells you something. Now, I don't know what it is with Ron. I honestly don't. I don't know what it is. But like when you see that, when everybody who watches him thinks he's 8 spots higher projected than where he's actually going to go, that means something else is happening.
Yes.
It was Cam Whitmore last year. I was like, this guy's the 4th overall pick. I watched him play. And then everyone's like, oh, well, we talked to him. We worked him out, and we think he's like 20th. There's something there. There's a reason why that's the case. So I don't know what it is with Ron Holland. I'm curious. Something to keep an eye on.
Of those 4, I've been vouching for Connect for a while now. I think that Connect will be good, but I've did a lot more research, both read your article and watched some tape on Cody Williams. And of those 4, that would be my top selection there.
Okay.
Connect number 2, and then probably Holland and Saloon.
I really think if Cody Williams clicks, it's pretty special. And the nice thing is, like, he's already shown he can shoot. Ron Holland has never shown he can shoot. That's a huge issue. That's a major problem. If you can't shoot in the NBA, you really can't play, especially if you want to have the ball in your hands. It's like we're talking about with Taylor Horton Tucker. Like, he wants to dribble and he can't dribble, or he can't shoot. Well, it doesn't matter if you dribble if you can't shoot, and that's a problem. At least Cody Williams can already shoot. So, like, the downside is maybe he just develops into a tall floor spacer who can also finish at the rim a little bit and attack closeouts, and he plays the power forward if he can put weight on his frame.
Yes.
If he starts dribbling and gets aggressive and shoots like that and still has his finishing ability, it really comes together quickly. And sometimes guys are late bloomers. Like, he was a really late bloomer in high school too, and then ended up as a good recruit, and then was projected as a top 4 pick, maybe the top overall pick, and got hurt, and it kind of derailed everything. That's a guy who I would not be unwilling to take a flyer on. So I think any of those guys, you're probably happy, but I could easily make the case for Holland, Williams, or Connect on draft night, really easily.
Thank you guys for tuning in to the Jazz Notes podcast. Next week, we will be back with the deadline movers player highlights. Talk about Kelly Olynyk, Simone Fontecchio, and Ochai Agbaji.
Yeah, we'll continue to break down the Utah Jazz players. We should have some more information from the draft, including the combine will be wrapped up. So stick around, subscribe. We'll be back next week with more Jazz Notes.